Hi, everyone. Well, I got a little pushback on the part one here. Someone was suggesting that it does appear that Jesus actually should be deemed cursed because he was hung on a tree. Doesn't it say that many, many places in the New Testament? Therefore, you're wrong, Doug. Jesus does come under Deuteronomy. Well, here's Deuteronomy 21, verse 23, King James. His body, this is in the Torah, talking about someone's body, not telling you the whole context yet. His body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God, the Lord Yahweh thy God, gives you for an inheritance. So what I was trying to argue last episode was the scholars of Operation Messiah are saying one of the things that was trying to be injected into Christianity is this false idea that Jesus is cursed because he was supposedly hung on a tree. That's Paul's words, okay? But that's Paul quoting the Torah about an actual tree, and then he's applying it to what is a piece of wood that Jesus is not hung from. His neck is not in a rope, and he's not hung to die. He's tortured by being hung in the sense of ropes put around his arms and nails in his hands, and it's a cruel and suffering death that would not have been the law of Moses that was under contemplation. If you were hung according to the law by a tree, it wasn't by the torturous means that the Romans did. But anyway, we're going to get into that, and that the point that the scholars were making and I was making is if you have a infiltrator who injects into Christianity something that is false, that Jesus is cursed, not doing an atonement for us, but cursed. This is a totally alternative means that Paul is saying this is Jesus taking away the curse. And actually, if you read in context, he means the curse of having to obey the law perfectly. You can't do it. So to remove that curse of obedience to God's law, he has to become a curse for us. All right, so let's look at the application of this. The question we're going to receive from a person named Appropriate is going to ask us about how do I square this with the fact that the New Testament has several passages that says Jesus was hung from a tree. Here's the question from the Appropriate 5 hours ago. I do, however, have one question. You briefly mentioned that Jesus was not hung on a tree, but was crucified on a cross. But there are 4 scriptures, 3 in Acts and 1 in 1 Peter, that all say that Jesus was hung on a tree. How do you square that? All right, so let's take a look here for a minute. There's a difference between those 4 passages and the passage involving Paul. Paul is quoting the Torah, where we know it means the word tree. See? We do not know, and we should not conclude that anybody else made the same mistake that Paul made of using a word in Greek to signify what in Hebrew, the original text, meant someone was hung from a tree, meaning that they were hung from an actual tree, meaning a branch of a tree, rope tied around the branch, pulled down to the person's necks, wrapped around their throat, an object thrown out from underneath them, and they fall to their death, almost instantaneous death, very little suffering, and that's what being hung from a tree means in the Torah. It does not mean being crucified on a cross is suffering from 6 to 4 days in slow, gradual asphyxiation, which I'm going to show you the big difference between these two things. And so the people speaking about hanging from a piece of wood is the right translation those 4 times. But then you have to ask yourself, would the translators want to make Paul look like he's correct, that Jesus actually hung from a tree, which in biblical sense means an actual tree, not a piece of wood that is cut up and then you're laid on it and tied and wrapped to it. That's not the same thing as being hung from a tree. Okay, but we'll take a look here because we don't want to take it lightly what he's saying here. So I just want to make sure we see that. Here's Galatians 3:13-14. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. And what was that curse? He says that curse is everyone who doesn't obey the law completely. And he misquotes Deuteronomy 26:27. We'll show you that as well in this text, just so we get a bigger picture of him. Paul, being made, Jesus was made a curse for us. And now he is cursed. That means he's going to hell. He's a sinner. He's going to take that attribution on. He's not an innocent lamb anymore. He's going to take on that curse from God. That's what the verse says. For it is written, cursed by God, is what it also says. Cursed is everyone that hangs on a tree. Okay, or anyone who is hung by a tree is really what it says. Not just that you hang. I'm having a jungle gym, a monkey bar here, and I'm hanging from the tree. No, it means you were hung by the tree. And it's kind of twist it a little bit there. That the blessing of Abraham might come on the Gentiles through Jesus Christ, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. So all this is about getting rid of the law. The Torah is a curse. It's, if you can't keep it completely, it's a curse to you. It totally misquotes Deuteronomy 27, as I will show you later. And that means we can then have the blessing of just having faith alone. We don't need to obey the letter of the law anymore or even read it. Just it's just a bygone. It's a tutor. We're adults. We don't need it anymore. And just as you can see, the word there is Xylon. Now, remember, Mouncy, he explains in his interlinear, I've learned since that he is bound to use the NIV translations because he is an NIV translator. So even though he's working on a team, he doesn't have the last word on what the meaning of words are. So you have to do is you got to look up the word Xylon there in his interlinear that pops, his lexicon that pops up when you press that word. What do you get? Wood, timber, 1 Corinthians, Revelation, stocks, a club, a post, a cross, a gibbet. Now, those are all acceptable meanings of those texts that say Jesus was hung by the cross or a piece of wood or a piece of timber, if you want to say that. But he wasn't hung from a tree. It's not a tree. When you've cut it down, you slice it up, and you've done a shape of it where you no longer kill someone quickly and by snapping their neck, by dropping them quickly out of a tree by rope around their neck, which the rope is then hung from a tree. No, that's a very humane way of killing someone when you use it by hanging them from the tree. But when you use the separate timbers to, put their hands out to the sides, what ends up happening is you force their breathing to be constricted over time, so they die of gradual asphyxiation, which is a very cruel death. Anyway, just want to show you here. This is a good way of looking at it. This is a sermon index. It says cross, Zulon, Xylon. So he's just point blank telling you that Zulon can be and is the meaning of the word cross. It literally means wood and refers to anything made of a wood, including a tree or other wooden article or substance. Again, you only can tell by context, and that's what I'm trying to give you. The context of the original passage in Hebrew, and then the context of the crucifixion of Christ, giving a completely different context from what the Torah said. So Paul's words, like I said, are the intended, according to the Operation Messiah, in reference to Jesus as cursed by having been hung by a tree, is to basically repel every Jewish person, because if that's the interpretation that Christians have legitimately believe, then there is no way in God's green earth that any Jewish person would ever accept that person as their Messiah. That's impossible from them. But a dumb Gentile, as we all are, don't know this, and we just read it, we gloss over it, and we do not understand the significance. So now, all right, so to gain that significance, we're going to take a look at the most modern Torah translation by a very conservative Hebrew scholar, a guy named Richard Elliott Friedman. He did this in 2005, I think it was. This is an excellent work, and I recommend every Christian who can afford this, it's not cheap, is to get it and then use it for reading the Torah, because it's unfiltered, meaning we don't get all these efforts to try to skew everything and tell you what Paul said and try to make you see things differently than what there is on the page. Just literally, you read the text the way it reads, and you get cleansed of the misinformation that you've been given. Anyway, so here is Deuteronomy 27, verse 22. This is the passage we're dealing with, 22 and 23. And here's what it actually says, what Paul's extracting from. And if there will be a sin bringing a sentence of death on a man, and he will be put to death, and you will hang him on a tree, that's how you're going to put him to death, you shall not leave his corpse on the tree, but you shall bury him on that day, because a hanged person is an offense to God, and you shall not make him impure. You shall not make impure your land that Yahweh your God is giving you as a legacy. So this word offense means cursed. It's a curse to God. This person is cursed, and that is true. So Jesus would become an offense to God, and he would turn away and never look in his direction ever again. That's different than atonement. The atonement is God pities the poor innocent animal that has been killed innocently for your sake, and it's intended in that situation to make you feel guilty for the atonement you caused. But in this case, this curse is taking away the laws having to apply to you, because Paul is quoting Deuteronomy 27, which we'll get into a little later, saying cursed is everyone who does not obey every command of the law. So basically, and that's false. That would mean you commit one command and now you're cursed, you're going to hell. No, that's not what the law says. And but Paul said it did. And what it says is, curses everyone who does not uphold this law to follow. And we'll give you that quote from Friedman later. But anyway, this is the true context, and you can just tell it's talking about someone who's hung from a tree, basically by being hung by a rope. And Brown Driver Briggs brings that home when you look at the verb there involved, tula, hang up, let down, dangle. You can just get the idea. This is hanging up any object. It's not someone who's being pinned to a beam and his hands tied to wooden posts to eat left and right, and his breathing is constricted. I mean, that's not hanging someone from, in a we can only say is a humane way of killing someone, quickly snapping their neck by letting a box or a animal be taken away underneath where their feet were stabilized. Anyway, I'll continue. Hang up any object, specifically putting to death by hanging. Again, what I just told you, what we normally would associate with hanging a person isn't putting them on a cross beam to cause them suffering over a long period of time. It would be a humane, quick death by hanging. No death is pleasant, but at least it's not as gruesome and grotesque as a Roman crucifixion. All right, and you'll see if you it's Talah here in the Bible Hub. It'll show you all these examples. Genesis 40 verse 19, from you and will hang you on a tree. From off thee shall hang thee on a tree. Okay, that's 22. But he hanged the chief baker. You can tell what that means. It doesn't mean he was put on a cross and suffered for 6 hours to 4 days to die. No, I don't think so. Deuteronomy 21:22 is the one we're talking about. And you hang him on a tree. The next verse was references in a parenthetical thought, for he who is hanged is accursed. That's how Deuteronomy 23 is translated in NAS. Again, accursed in KJV, accursed. And INT is interesting. It changes it, is accursed. Okay, so you have all those references: offense, accursed, synonymous, and so on and so forth. And the word tree in Hebrew is ha'etz, meaning trees, or wood. Okay, so it has a variable meaning, but obviously you can't hang a person from a piece of wood. The wood has to be affixed to a tree somehow, and then then if it's a tree branch, now you can be hung by the tree. But a piece of wood by itself, unless you specially construct it into a torture mechanism, cannot be anything. Uh, it would normally be hanging the person the normal way we'd expect the person being hung by the neck through a rope, instead of being tortured to death by a cross, tying someone tight to a cross so they can't breathe, gradually dying of asphyxiation. I'll show you that in a minute. All right, and in case you don't know what we're talking about, here's the example of kindness by the Catholics. Roman Catholics were very kind to the Protestant Calvinists, and this is what they did. It was Alba, as I recollect, comes into the Netherlands and kills 26,000 people this way, just men, women, and children. They didn't care. And we're all up in arms about what's going on in the Middle East. Sometimes people need to go back and look at our own sins, just to say. But I'm not justifying anything there. I'm just saying this is how brutally the Roman Catholic Church treated Protestants. And this is called the Execution of the Protestants in the Netherlands, Fleming, 1899, done by Leopold Fleming. Anyway, here's what crucifixion methods in Rome are like. The history and pathology of crucifixion. Let's just see. I just want to show you where this came from and where you can definitively know this did not exist at the time of Moses when he's inspired by God to write the Torah, wrote Deuteronomy 21, the passage at issue that Paul's quoting about accursed is the one who is hung on a tree. And then he says that's true of Jesus. Jesus was hung on a tree. That's what he says. This is not what that could have meant in context, because the whole concept of crucifixion comes way late in history. So here's this true history of that, excluding and negating the very possibility of what Paul's claiming is true. In antiquity, crucifixion was considered one of the most brutal, and so did I mention this? This is a PubMed article by a medical, it's in a medical journal, South African Medical Journal, 2003, December, number 93, volume or edition 12. Anyway, it says this: in antiquity, crucifixion was considered one of the most brutal and shameful modes of death, probably originating with the Assyrians and Babylonians. Now that's way after Israel, and it has nothing to do with Israel. They never had that. It was used systematically by the Persians in the 6th century BC. Alexander the Great brought it from there to the Eastern Mediterranean countries in the 4th century BC, and the Phoenicians introduced it to Rome in the 3rd century BC. It was virtually never used in pre-Hellenic Greece. The Romans perfected crucifixion for 500 years until it was abolished by Constantine I in the 4th century AD. Crucifixion in Roman times was applied mostly to slaves, disgraced soldiers, Christians, and foreigners, only very rarely to Roman citizens. Death, usually after 6 hours to 4 days, was due to a multifactorial pathology. I'm just going to jump over some of the other ones, but the guaranteed, the most important factor, it says here, was progressive asphyxia caused by impairment of respiratory movement. So no matter what you did, you could struggle to, push your feet up. There was a little place you could do that with, or try to hold your arms as long as you possibly could. But gradually, slowly, you'll lose the energy and the strength, and you will basically, by the sheer weight of your body, basically die over a period of time. Okay, so you can just see there's a complete mismatch with what Paul is claiming and the Bible. Paul is applying a crucifixion and saying that's being hung on a tree when that is completely countertextual. That is counter-historical and countertextual. You read, I just read for you Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23. You can see it does not mean what Paul says. Now we're going to look at an article that was very well done on why does the Bible say Jesus was hanged on a tree? Yes, why did the Bibles not change this to on a piece of wood, on a timber, on a cross? Because it means all those things in other passages, but they won't translate it this way. When in those 4 examples, why don't they just say he was hung on a piece of timber, something like that? But they want to confirm Paul instead of showing how wrong he truly is. So let's look at it. And this article make this point. This is by Sean Brazo. He did this in April 2015, entitled "Why Does the Bible Say Jesus Was Hanged on a Tree?" And he points out that when you read the King James Bible, it says Jesus was hanged on a tree. The Greek word thus translated is zulon, wood. Note those 5 occurrences. So it's not 4, it's 5 actually. But I'm going to pause here for a minute. He's going to show you that the King James Bible is completely inconsistent and translates the word in other contexts where it's not about Jesus being hung. So it matches Paul. Where it doesn't have to match Paul, they tell you the truth. It's a piece of wood or timber or something else. It's just so obviously it's biased translate. It's theological translations. The God of our fathers raised up, Acts 5:30. The God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom ye slew and hanged on a tree. Acts 10, verse 39. And we are witnesses of all things which he did, both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem, whom they slew and hanged on a tree. Acts 13, verse 29. And when they had fulfilled all that was written of him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a sepulchre. There's a real crime against, come on. Took him down from a tree. Is there literally a tree planted there on that hill? No. This is the insanity of being so theologically driven that you don't care, no matter how silly it sounds, you're going to just confirm Paul no matter what in his silly statement by translating it so he looks like he's got cover from these other 5 passages. But I digress. Let's keep going. Galatians 3:13. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone that hangs on a tree. That's the passage at issue here. That the Operation Messiah was saying, this is the poison pill. This is what will make Jews repelled from Christianity if we teach this, is the Gentiles could be brainwashed to talk like this and not realize the repercussion. 1 Peter 2, verse 24, who is his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree. Was there a tree there on the hill, ladies and gentlemen? Tell me you think there was a tree with branches and birds perching on them. And no, that we, being dead to sin, should live unto righteousness, by those whose stripes ye were healed. Now here's Brousseau's comment. It would be profitable to see how our 1611 translators handled that Greek word zulon elsewhere in the New Testament. That would be a very interesting thing, wouldn't it? When the multitude came with Judas to arrest Jesus, the Bible says they came with swords and staves. Matthew 26, verse 47. Staves, wooden clubs, in Greek is, zulon. This word appears again in verse 55. So why couldn't it have been Jesus was hung on a stave, basically a pike kind of thing? And that's exactly what it is, except that it's a cross pike. So it's 2 pikes. That's what it was. It was a stave, if you want to use another word. A cross of 2 staves. That's another way of defining it. He goes on, in discussing the quality of the Christian's doctrine evaluated the judgment seat of Christ, Paul talked about gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, 1 Corinthians 8:3-12. Guess what the word wood is? It's zulon. Why not put in there a tree? Paul talked about gold, silver, precious stones, trees, hay, and stubble. Why didn't they do that? Because they know Paul was quoting a passage that did mean tree, and he said Jesus was hung on a tree, and now they're trying to make that word mean tree wherever it appears, no matter how nonsensical it would be, except here where they have to tell you some truth, right? Jesus Christ, dictating to the Apostle John what he is to write to the Jewish assembly at Ephesus, said, he that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says unto the churches. To him that overcomes will I give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. Revelation 2:7. That probably does mean tree because it's fruits, right? And that means you can use that. In the new heaven and new earth, we read about the tree of life bearing 12 manner of fruits, yielding fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Zulon is translated 3 times in these 3 verses. Tree, the tree of life, is again mentioned in Revelation 22:14. So nobody would dispute that means a tree because you can tell from context. It's not a piece of wood. They didn't eat from a piece of wood. They ate from a tree. While describing the wealth of the Antichrist government and its economic collapse, we read of gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, scarlet, thine, wood, ivory vessels, precious wood vessels, brass, iron, and marble. Revelation 18, verse 22. But the King James doesn't say tree. They didn't say there were precious tree vessels or precious thine trees. No, it's wood. Okay, now I want you to actually please read again with me Acts 5:30 and tell me every time you see this, can you imagine that there's actually a physical tree on the hill with branches and birds flying around, all that, when I read these verses to you? The God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom you slew and hanged on a tree. Is that what you envision? That would make any sense that he was hung like this somehow he was going to suffer and all this stuff, and his hands will be pierced, even as it's prophesied in Psalm 22, and his feet would be pierced. All these things are happening, and he's hung on a tree with branches and everything? No way. Let's read the next one, Acts 10:39. And we are witnesses of all things which he did both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem, whom they slew and hanged on a tree. Again, can you imagine that this piercing of his hands and his feet and his being parched and dying a slow death and, basically being tortured, that has to do with being hung on a tree with branches and everything? No way. You need to hear it so you realize how nonsensical the translation is as a tree. When it knows, King James is very capable of, I showed you, using the very same word, it'll translate as wood when it wants to, when it makes as much sense, when it makes sense. And here it doesn't make sense. It could be a physical tree. Do you not get that? But Paul said he was hung on a tree. There's no reason to translate this as tree except Paul's passage in Galatians 3:13. I'll go on here. Here's Galatians 3:13, where it has to be tree because that's what it meant in the Hebrew. So this is the passage that is forcing all these nonsensical Acts 5:30, Acts 10:39, 13:29 to all be mistranslated as tree when that's absurd. Jesus not hung from a tree with branches and things growing out, birds flying around. That's ridiculous. The Romans never did that. Let's put it that way. They never hung people on physical trees, at least in this era. Let's put it that way. 1 Peter 2:24, same thing. Who his own self bore our sins in his own body on the tree. No, on the wood stake, on the wood staves, on the cross of wood staves, whatever you want to say, but it's not a tree. It's ridiculous. Again, that's the absurdity of Paul. When you listen to him and he applies something in the Bible that's a curse on someone hung on a tree, we know what that means, and that's not what happened to Jesus. He was tied to the staves, a cross of staves of pieces of wood, timber wood, that then cruelly killed him gradually by having been roped and nails put in his hands and rope hung around his wrists to keep him up there as long as possible. And the longer that happened, the worse the stress was, and it would cause you normally to die very slowly, gradually. But I digress. Okay, so I think I made my point. This is a theological translation issue. Once again, it has nothing to do with truth. It's all about Paul. Paul has to win. But But when you look at Operation Messiah, they're saying, look at this passage's significance. It would repel Christians from ever wanting to, any Jew from ever wanting to follow Christ, because it's so offensive to their theology. And God even says in the passage I quoted you, it's an abomination to have this person's body out and like that. And you have to bury it fast. Don't wait any period of time. Just do that, because it's an abomination. All right. Now, I just want to explain before I let you go that I mentioned in Galatians 3:10, Paul is saying the obedience to the law becomes a curse to us because we can't keep it all. And so he misstates and misconstrues the passage, and I'll show you what the real passage says in a second. Galatians 3:10, for as many as are the works of the law are under the curse. For as many as are of the works of the law, meaning is any person who is trying to obey God's law, are under the curse. It is written, cursed is everyone that continues not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. So what Paul is saying is there, if you try to obey God's word, the law, you're under a curse, because if you fail to keep just one, you will be cursed forever, damned to hell. And so how are you going to get out of that situation? Okay. Now, it doesn't say that. That's what you need to know. Okay, now I'm going to read you the verse from Deuteronomy 27, which Paul was basing Galatians 3:10, this idea that obedience to the law is a curse. So if you try to obey God's law, you're cursed. So he's not saying you're cursed for sinning, you're cursed for trying to obey God's law. So the object of Jesus is going to be taking away that curse, meaning the law itself. This is how he's arguing the Torah is done away with in Galatians. Remember, Jesus is very aware apparently that the law was given by angels through a mediator in Galatians 3:19, just a few verses later. So it wasn't even given by God Yahweh, and so Jesus came to free us from that law, which is really bondage to these weak and beggarly angels. So if you read the bigger context, you can get this, but that's way beyond the context of what we're talking about just for now. It's simply look at this passage, how he misread it. And here's how it actually reads. Deuteronomy 27, verse 26. And if you read any Bible, this will come out the same way. But this is Friedman. This is the current translation that Jews around the world respect as their very scholarly and correct translation. And says, cursed be one who will not uphold the words of this instruction to do them, and all the people shall say amen. So all this is if you say that the law does not have to be followed at all, and you do not uphold that it as a principle is what you are to follow, you are therefore accursed. Same as being a apostate. You are telling people not to follow God's law when it applies to them. Even though it applies to them, you're saying don't follow it. And that's the cursed is that person, not the person who can't keep every part of the law, because the whole atonement is predicated on the fact people are going to fail. So atonement doesn't remove curses. It just atones for sin. It's a process of forgiveness. You have to do your works worthy repentance. Then you can come with your atonement. And when you do that, God will forgive you. But if you don't do your works of atonement, your works worthy righteousness first, you can't even use the atonement. So all these things I've shown you earlier. And that's what it means when it says in the law and the prophets, God prefers obedience over sacrifice. Sacrifice is secondary. Primarily is you have to repent first, then you can come bring your sacrifice. Anyway, so Paul took this verse, misstated it, misquoted it, and then used it to make the law, obedience to God's law, the curse that Jesus then in 2 verses later removes by becoming a curse himself on the tree where he allegedly was hung, which isn't even true. He was never hung on a tree. He was affixed to a stake, a stave, if you will, of 2 beams, one a cross beam. All right. So in sum, I'm going to say to the appropriate, thank you very much for writing. The answer to your question is Jesus was not hung on a tree in the sense of the verse that Paul had quoted from, which is Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23. Instead, he was suspended, if you will, by ropes from on his arms on 2 staves of wood. So the only thing proper to say is he was hung on a piece of wood or some wood staves. That's the only thing that would be correct. And so all those passages should not have said tree, which is absurd, and should have said he was hung on the pieces of wood. Something like that, but nothing like what we read today. And therefore, what you're actually exposing is the KJV and a lot of other Bibles that are theologically driven in their translation to make Paul look like he's making sense when it's nonsense that Jesus was actually hung on a tree, which would mean he'd have to be hung from a limb of a tree, a real tree, a real living tree with branches and everything like that. That is not what the Romans ever did of anybody. They did not hang people from trees. They tortured them through the two uses of two staves, a crossbeam, and a main pole. And that's what happened to Jesus. So Paul had it completely wrong factually, but definitely as a mission infiltrator into the Christian church, his goal was to do what? To basically defame Jesus, because that's what the Herodians were doing. Herod wanted Jesus dead. Herod the Antipas sent Jesus back to Pilate, and it's very clear in context when you read the historical records of Josephus that this is where their friendship began. They'd been hostile to each other, but after Pilate did what he did, executing Jesus, then Herod Antipas became friends again with Pilate. And so that was a payoff that Pilate got by taking care of Jesus. Then the followers of Jesus have to get this very insulted, low view of Jesus, and that would be to say he was cursed, not just the idea of atonement would be too nice. They want him to be cursed. So he is in nowhere other than in hell forever and suffering. And that's his punishment for his taking on our curse of obeying our curse that we have to obey the law perfectly, which is false. And so Paul on several levels is playing a very propagandistic approach that a infiltrator would try to do, which is mess up the law when you discuss it, misquote it, miscite it, then misapply it to Jesus' crucifixion and turn that into a hanging on a tree with branches and birds and all that kind of stuff. Ridiculous stuff. Yet we suck it all in because our translators are agents of cooperation with the infiltrator. They don't know he's an infiltrator probably now, but they feel they must uphold everything he says, no matter how absurd it is. So the 4 times I showed you that it's quoted, hung on a tree, should be hung on, it should say was hanged on a pole or a post or cross beams or whatever you want to say, but it's not a tree. And therefore it does not come within the meaning of Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 to 23. All right. God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.